Hi, this is Stefan from Blindleister, and today is the first episode of how to evaluate good spots in the German electricity grid, how to evaluate free capacity, and this with respect to different resources such as photovoltaic, wind, and batteries. Today we start with the first episode about photovoltaic. Therefore, we got an example to investigate here, which is close to the UW substation Meize, so which is exactly here, this area. But I try to show how to do it in a very structured way to get the full picture of this area, of this grid area, to understand if it's worth pursuing or not. So first of all, the approach should be to go from macro to micro to understand if this is a good place to plan PV, large utility scale PV installations. So we will connect to the 110 kV network level. This is why I just selected this here. And we need to understand what kind of installations are already there, what kind of generation is in this area. Therefore, we know, okay, Substation Meize is in the state of Niedersachsen. So we select Niedersachsen, and we are interested in renewable energies here mainly. And we select also the ones that are connected to the medium voltage network, not only to extra high voltage and high voltage network. Great. And now we have the option to filter for different powers. We want to plan like a large utility scale PV park. So we're interested in the big generation. So 1 megawatt is fine here. And we load the plants. So we did that and we get a good first overview what is exactly like installed in this area. We see there's a lot of wind installed. Yeah, we can click also on PV here. This is quite a bigger PV park, but in general there's not much PV installed. It's mainly wind. So, okay, we get an idea what are the main resources here. And we see already, okay, there's not much PV installed at UW Meize, one installation with 10 megawatt. Okay, and that's it. What is very important is to see, okay, what is the nearby grid connection? And this is the 110 kV line here, which goes all the way. So what will happen is that we will, if we plan a PV installation here, actually feed into this line, most likely. So the second step is, after seeing what is actually installed already, what is going to be planned. Maybe there is already something planned, a big other installation, which might be not in our best interest, which makes this kind of area already uninterested for us. So let's check what is planned. So we go on in planning and we also load plans and we see, okay, there is a battery plant here, not very big. There is some biomass plant here. There is solar plant here. Okay, but also rather small installation, 1.5 megawatt. And there is wind plant here, even more wind. Okay. So how big is the wind that is planned here? 5.7 megawatt, 5.7 megawatt. So quite huge wind turbines. So after seeing that, we see, okay, there is not much PV plant, no big PV installations. Let's check how the capacity is at the moment. So therefore, we go on Capacity Atlas. We switch it on and we see, okay, the line and the substation where we are most likely to be connected to is red, which means there is not much connection capacity left at that point. So let's try to understand a little bit more why in a later step. But first of all, we are also interested in what is planned when it comes to future grid development plans. Maybe this kind of line here is going to be strengthened. Therefore, we go on other options and reports. We go here on extra high voltage infrastructure, but we only select the DSO because we're planning to have a PV installation which will be connected most likely not to 220 kV and higher, but to the 110 kV distribution system. So we unselect this, and we also want to have this whole thing ready till 2030. We make apply, and we will see, okay, what is going to be planned here. And we see, okay, in this area, this is interesting because here Avacon is planning an additional line with 632 megavolt ampere, the new apparent power. And it's most likely connected to this area here, bypassing this kind of line and splitting up the power flow. So this helps to understand. And now we also understand a little bit more how these wind power plants here can be planned in the future, because there will be some extension here. So this new power can be integrated into the grid, although it's already quite congested here, meaning the capacity atlas shows us it's red. So now we dive into what is actually the load in this area. So we select loads here on the right side, and we see, okay, we are in the area of Hanover. So Hanover is a sink, a load sink, and the surroundings of Hanover is also quite big loads, which we can see here. So this is kind of good for developing generation, of course, with the intention to be close to loads. But as we can also see, there is no future loads planned at the moment. We don't see that any big data center or anything is planned in this area. It's more like here, okay, that something is planned here, Salzgitter 2026. So nothing to consider when it comes to loads. We unselect loads, and we check now how much curtailment actually happened in this area. So we go here and select load redispatch DSO to understand better how much curtailment actually happened. So it's loading, which we can see with the lower bar here, and it's ready. We select redispatch DSO, we click on the county, and we get the region. We already see, okay, here is a lot of curtailment. Here it's also quite some curtailment, and so on. So it's a curtailed area here, especially this line is affected a lot. We can also click here and see, okay, how it goes further. But let's stick to this county. And we want to analyze now more how much are the substations at this line affected actually. So let's get a report for this. It's the DSO substation report, and click apply. So it takes a moment. We have more than 10 million curtailment measures now in our data bank. And once it's ready, we can have a closer look on the DSO substation report. We see the affected substations here. They are aggregated over the time, over 1 year in the first figure, and then every substation is analyzed. So let's dive into the 3 substations one by one. This is one substation, UW Büren. This is one substation we are most interested in, UW Meize and UW Burgwedel. Okay, let's have a look at Meize. That's the substation here. We see the total energy generation over the last 12 months. We see the total energy curtailment. But what's mostly interesting is how much curtailment did actually happen. So we see, okay, curtailment happened a lot for wind, especially like in December, January, February, and April. Also in June, actually, was quite windy. So it hit with respect to the generation up to 30% here in this 1 week in February. PV wasn't that much curtailed, as we can see here. So it's like a little bit less. Okay. So let's go on with the next substation, which is Burgwedel at this line. This 110 kV line, and we see it here and also here like a lot of wind curtailment, which makes up 97%, not so much PV curtailment, and it hits here 18% of the total generation this week. And the last one, we can go back, is the substation Burgwedel. Oh, sorry, we got it already. UW Büren. Let's have a look at UW Büren, which is here, and also here we see, okay, a lot of wind curtailment, which is not good for wind, but since now it's more in the mind of the system operators to have a look on the complementary nature of PV and wind, it's still interesting, of course, for PV to get connected, because we also see that the curtailment in the summer months, March, April, May, is less than, of course, in the winter months. After analyzing this network region with the help of the substation reports, we could see that mainly wind power plants are curtailed here, and the curtailment is quite high. On the contrary, like PV is still not very curtailed, and we have a good chance, based on the idea of installing complementary resources, to better utilize the grid here. So this is why on a macro level, we see, okay, there is a lot of like curtailment and contingencies on the line and the substations, but we can also see that during the summer months and the PV curtailment is not that high. So now we dive in more on the micro level of the substation Meize by opening the substation analysis tool. Here you can see what kind of plants are directly connected, with the straight lines here to the substations, and what kind of plants are indirectly connected by the dashed lines. You can also see an overview of solar power, wind power, and other power that is connected, and also what kind of plants are affected through curtailment, which do not need to be like connected to the substation, because they can be like very small plants but are still curtailed in this area. Also, what is very important is how many transformers are actually in the substation. We have identified through satellite images 2 transformers with a capacity of around 80 MVA, and it's a radial feeder, so the substation is ending and not continuing with another line here. So this is important, and based on that, we can generate a substation report, which gives a very insightful view onto the 15 minutes generation and also the load in 15-minute steps in this area. We just do apply, and it needs some time. It also considers curtailment, but in the end, we get like a report about the substation Meize, which we can use to understand much better how much wind generation happened in this area, how much PV generation happened, which is here, for example, 15 terawatt hours. This is 67 gigawatt hours, generation. And we also see the curtailment. For example, the wind curtailment amounts to 2.8 gigawatt hours, yeah, which is approximately like something between 5 and 10% here. Like I think it's like 6 to 7% of the generation. But the PV curtailment with 56 megawatt hours is quite small in comparison to the generation, which is good. Because as a rule of thumb, you can assume that if the redispatch or curtailment is lower than 2%, it's still good to build the same resources at a certain connection, whereas a curtailment of 5 to 10% or even higher is not really good for the resource to be built. So I wouldn't recommend here to request, for example, more wind capacity. In comparison, PV seems to be good, but we can also try to understand how much PV is good here. So therefore, we need to we have to consider the maximum net load and the minimum net load. The maximum net load is the difference between load and generation. So the max net load, which amounts to 30 megawatt. So this is very important. So this area seems to be a load sink because there are like different cities. And with respect to generation, there is a maximum load of 30 megawatt. For example, if there is nearly no generation in this area because there is no wind and no sun shining. On the contrary, there is an export reached in the last 12 months of 22.6 megawatt in total. This was the highest export at a certain point because the load consumption was very low at that point, and there was a lot of generation in this network area. This is important to remember here because this value is something we consider to think of, okay, what kind of PV utility plant we can still build. So this is like, let's say 23 megawatt. We know, okay, we have here 2 transformers built, but we have to consider different factors. For example, the system operator will never use the full capacity. Like he's evaluating such a location by saying, okay, the transformer loading should be maximum 60 to 65% roughly, because he also needs to consider static power flows and n-1 criteria. So in case something fails, so he would say from 160 at least roughly 90 MVA can only be used. So in this case, we assume, okay, we have 25 megawatt injecting into the grid maximum, because there is a huge load here, load center. And we also have only a certain power line here to absorb the additional generation. And we click on it and we can see, okay, we have 2 circuits, 6 cables, because we also have in the same overhead line 220 kV, which we can see here when we toggle. It's written here. And the 110 kV line can only have roughly 123 MVA in this case, which means we can also not use the full capacity of the line. So usually the system operator is already not happy if 70 to 80% of the line is used, but rule of thumb here is also trying to reach a capacity of 50%, which limits the capacity to 60 MVA. And if we assume here it is 23 megawatt injection, like max, when we see, okay, generation and load balance out at the worst case, then we have still like a capacity of roughly 30 megawatt of injection here. But to be more conservative, we can also reduce it maybe by 5 to 10 megawatt. So it would make sense to request in this area another, let's say 20 to 25 megawatt of photovoltaic, under the assumption that the system operator is really checking also the complementary behavior of wind and PV in this region, because if he doesn't, then he will only say, okay, this line is very congested and we can't connect anything more. But if you already know there is mainly wind and PV can be a good addition to it, you can very differently approach the system operator here. And by knowing even a certain capacity you can request, it helps much more in the planning phase if this is an interesting network area or not.